Hi there and welcome to this week's lesson. So this is week 5 of my course Becoming a Better Artist by Practicing Drawing. So we've covered quite a lot of ground so far, and I'm pleased to say that all these videos, they're going to be online and available for you at any point you want to return to. If you're new to the course, just check out the playlist and you can watch some of the material that we've covered. So just as a little recap, we've looked at practicing drawing on a regular basis, which I said is the foundation to becoming a better artist. By practicing drawing, you need to practice, obviously. Then we talked about contour drawing and learning to look at the world. Then we had a look at construction drawing and trying to master the skills of drawing simple shapes in perspective. So cubes, cylinders, cones, that sort of thing. Last week we had a look at tonal drawing, and I did a few demonstrations with charcoal, both adding charcoal, rubbing charcoal away, and also creating gradients with clear sort of sections of tone. So those are all great lessons, and I say you're free to revisit them at any time you like. So this week I'm particularly interested in looking at the subject of texture and mark making. So I've chosen this image behind me. This is Albrecht Dürer, and I've always been very keen on this. This is a watercolor study of a hare, and I think it really illustrates, it's got an amazing sense of texture. It's incredibly lifelike, but we really get a feeling of the fur and the animal sitting there. So I put together a few examples that I thought I might show you to perhaps get the inspiration going. So I've got this picture. This is by Goya, called The Little Prisoner, and obviously it's a bit of a dark image, but I'm particularly interested here in his use of hatching and how that those small hatching marks all seem to help create this sort of the mood and the atmosphere of the piece. Okay, so I think it's a really nice use. Goya was keen on etchings, and again, etching and that sort of work, it tends to lean itself towards the sort of texture and cross-hatching skills that we're going to be looking at this week. So this is a Chinese sort of ink landscape painting, and although we're sort of perhaps, this is still what I would call a drawing, but it's also using perhaps watercolor, ink, and different media like that. You can see it's got a very nice sense of depth and atmosphere with Chinese watercolors. They're great for this economy of style, saying a lot with very little. And their work, or the marks, are very influenced by sort of calligraphy and writing. And you'll see, also like it's got some simple ideas there, like very dark marks in the foreground, and then this sort of subtle, sort of like almost like mountaintop in the distance. Just very clever use of mark making to create depth and atmosphere. Okay, so this next one I've got is Magritte. And again, I think it's a really nice example of variety of mark and this sort of hatching and stippling effect. And I can perhaps give you a quick sort of close-up. Let's go in a bit closer. Obviously it's a digital image, so you can hopefully just see there's hatching, stippling, there's some mark making to sort of suggest wood and some waves, all done with something like a pencil or marks like that. Okay, so we're going to try to learn about how to make these marks and just try to broaden our range, but I'm hoping these might give you some ideas about how you might then incorporate it into your drawing. So I've got a Giacometti drawing here. So if any of you have been to the Cambridge Art Centre up near Norwich, you might have seen some Giacometti sculptures. He's most famous for his sculptures, but he was also an excellent sort of draftsman and created these great drawings. So last week when we looked at toned work and toned paper, you can see here how this is almost like this sort of somewhere between a drawing and a painting. But you'll notice his particular drawing style. Each artist tend to have their own marks. The Magritte image was very sort of discrete marks and very neat and tidy. This is a bit more what we might call, this is more expressionistic. Okay. Giacometti's drawings can look a bit like scribbles, but you can see, you know, out of these scribbles and these fast, sort of sharp marks emerges this great sense of form, depth and space. Okay, so it's another great example of mark making. And so lastly, I just thought I'd throw in another Van Gogh drawing. Of course, Van Gogh was also very influenced by, I think he was influenced by sort of Japanese prints. And he used a reed pen, and the reed pen gives a great opportunity for different marks. And you can just see the variety here and how he's using mark making to describe the world, different textures and different sort of different materials. Okay, so one of the things that I want to talk about is, mark making, one of the things that makes for good images is variety. Variety is an important concept when it comes to composition and design. And a really good illustration for this is when you go into a baker's shop and you see all the different coloured like buns and cakes and, you know, sausage rolls, and all that variety tends to be very visually appealing. If everything looked the same, if it was just repetition, that isn't quite as visually stimulating as variety. And that principle feeds over into our drawings. So if you always draw with the same line, the same weight, the same marks, it can make your drawings look a bit flat, and somehow it doesn't invite the viewer to look again and sort of discover new things. So introducing variety you can do it in all sorts of ways, with tone, with line, but we're going to look at how to introduce variety with texture. So what I'm going to do is go over to Clip Studio Paint and give you some examples of how you might start to practice and develop your mark making. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to make a few quick points is when I think of texture, we're talking about the ability for, when we're looking at the objects that we've drawn, is to get a sense of what they're made of and what they feel like. So the first thing I would say is, let's take the example of a tree, okay? Before we get into the marks of the leaves, what I would say is when you're doing texture, okay, focus on your outline. So last week we talked about, well, the week before we talked about construction. So let's say we've got our, you know, we've got some sort of feeling of a form of a tree, okay? That would be like our initial sort of mark making. Well, that's our sort of abstract idea of the tree. But when we want to create the feeling of the tree, what I would say is focus on outline, okay? Outline will do a lot to trick the eye to tell you what the rest of the object looks like, regardless of how you get into all the details in here. Okay, so it's like also when you're doing, or just finish this off. Okay, so let's... And these lines here that I did for this tree, so remember we did these how to draw straight lines, they're not what you want for texture. With texture, you're actually trying to encourage yourself to be able to add variety, okay? And we do things like that. And then with our leaves, we can develop some sort of shorthand mark making to suggest the leaves, okay? So that's going to come useful when we do the exercises a bit later. So that's the first thing, is to focus on outlines. Okay, outlines will say a lot about what you're looking at. Okay, so what I've done here is I've created a rectangle of dark to light. This is to make you aware of an idea in texture, which is most textured surfaces, if you think of them, are probably comprised of, you either have a smooth surface, like in this case a gradient that goes from light to dark, or you're going to have a rough surface. And what makes a surface rough is a combination of bumps and dips. So a really good example of this is if you look at some fruit like an orange. If you look at the skin of an orange, you'll probably see on it lots of little dents, okay? Or you could think of the other bits as bumps. Strawberries also are quite good at this. So just being able to get your mind around this simple idea of these sort of bumps and dips, I think really helps. So if we take this surface here, if I okay, so I've created a circle here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill this with a gradient. Okay, so now I've filled that with a gradient, and so what I'm suggesting here is because our light source comes in this direction, our light source is coming in that direction, it hits this surface here, okay, that creates light, and then over here we have shadow, okay? So that gives us the feeling of a raised surface. So it's a simple idea. If I was sort of sketching this, let's say I was doing mark making, I would just want to have a little bit of a mark there, okay? So if I have shadow on one side, and then if I go light, like that. Okay, so that's it, basically not blended, okay? If I was to blend it, then it starts to look more like a little lump, okay? So we could do another one here. We take that dark color. So if we take a dark color, and then we've got this sort of a shape, and then we just need to go a little bit lighter. And then we would have, so you see it looks a bit like a sphere, but all of these things hopefully are giving you the feeling of the raised surface, okay? So let's reverse that and see what that looks like. So now if I put my gradient in the opposite direction, like so, maybe like so, okay? Hopefully you can see that that now looks more like a dip, okay? So let's just remember, so the light's coming this way, okay? So it's hitting this sort of rim here, like that, and it's creating a shadow that way. So now with those two ideas, I can create the feeling of a textured surface. So I'll add some bumps and dips here and see what you think. Okay, so there's a few. So let me just, now what I'm doing here is I'm doing this in a very simplified way, but hopefully they're going to give you just some feelings about how to create this feeling of texture, okay? So if I just pick out my pen here. Okay, so this one here is a bump, okay, because the light hits it there and there's a shadow there. You could almost have a cast shadow around there. Okay, this one is a dip. Okay, so this cuts against the light, so you get shadow there. The light catches it there. This one is a dip, and this one is a dip, and that one is a bump. Okay, because the shadow is there. Okay, so that relates a little bit to tone. But I'm thinking that simple idea might help you when it comes to making your marks and creating a feeling of texture. Okay, so the next thing I'd like you to have a go at is I'm going to do some examples of a texture reference chart. Now, what I like to do when I'm doing my life drawing classes, I actually encourage people to, whatever medium you're using, is at the edge of the page, just go down and try to make as much variety of marks as you can. Now, often people will do that and then they'll carry on drawing as usual. The idea, though, is to try to incorporate your marks into your drawing, okay, like some of the examples we saw earlier. Now, I'm working digitally here today, so it means I can't perhaps get, I mean, I can use lots of different tools here, but that's not going to be quite I think for today I'm just going to use a pen tool to give you some examples of just what you can do out of line in terms of hatching and mark making that way. But if you're using things like charcoal or sort of pastels or something like that, try to experiment with the marks that you can get by doing things like rubbing out, smudging, scribbling, all the different ways that you can apply the materials, the medium, that will add to your range of marks. Okay, but here I'm just going to go through, and this is what you could do is even as one of your morning pages exercise. Okay, so we'll start off and we just do one sort of square of texture. Okay, and this is one I quite like, which is just sort of scribbles. Okay, but quite sort of each texture will have its own sort of, each square should have its own quality. So here I'm going to do hatching in a more sort of deliberate way, and this time I'm not zigzagging, I'm just going in a single direction. I'm going to do these a little bit faster just so you can get a feel for them. Okay, so that's another one. I'll speed this up for you. I'll do a few and then see what you think. Okay, so there we go. So there's a few examples for you, and as I say, I'm working quite quickly there. So there's also, you can also improve your variety of mark by playing with some key ingredients. So you can do fast, slow, deliberate, a bit like the Chinese sort of brush work. And you can also, if you're using pencils or pen, you can vary the pressure with hard marks, okay, and soft. And you can do rubbing out. Okay, so all of those can open up doors for creating marks and texture. The other thing I haven't mentioned here is these are marks that you're getting by the implement. Often, like, you can get a lot of mileage by different textured papers. So coarse paper with a very strong grain, that will create its own texture. You can also try baking sort of sheets of baking paper, tracing paper. You can get paper and you can scrunch it up first and then sort of almost do like a rubbing on it, and that will bring out the texture of where you've creased it all up. So there's all sorts of ways. I know when I was at art school, we did a lot of, you know, they made us go round a few days and do sort of rubbings, you know, with sort of paper and rubbing on textures and just trying to discover different textures, okay? So this is by no means an exhaustive list. I did include this one at the bottom. It's not quite a texture. It's a sort of, it's a loose idea of how to draw the moon. And one of my friends, James, was very keen. I think I remember seeing him do this. And it illustrates what I was talking to you about, the dents. So here, the dents, we get shadow on one side, and then on the shadow side of the moon, you would get little bits of light. Okay, so that's just to show you how that principle would work. in actual practice, but that could be anything. It could be an orange or a strawberry or something like that. So that's the first step, is to try to develop your range of textures. The next exercise which is good to do, which is go back to our simple forms. Okay, so our simple forms, let's see if I've still got the hang of it. Cubes, spheres, okay, and we could do cones. So now what we can do is, once we've got our simple forms, we can actually try to apply texture to those, okay? So if I make them a bit more transparent, then what I'm going to do is apply some texture. So we're going to make this first one, let's imagine this is like brick, okay? So we're going to try and make it sort of broken. Now before I speed it up, one thing I will say here is a couple of points. Is we want our texture, you know, when we talked about wrapping lines, so in this case there's perspective implied. Ooh. So when I'm doing my texture, I want to be aware of that perspective, even if it's just, it's not all my lines have to follow it, but I need to be aware of it, okay? And the other thing I want to be aware of is I want to be aware of the light, because let's say we've got light coming from this side, so we've got marks on that side. Well, on this side, let's put this into shadow, our marks and our texture need to emphasize not just the form and the direction, but also the light and the shade, and so that will come in more obvious when I do the sphere. Okay, so that's about how texture relates to form in terms of wrapping lines and emphasizing the form, and also how it relates to light. So I'm going to give those a quick go. Okay, so there we go. We can see our simple forms now have been sort of described using some texture. So this one's a little bit like, I don't know whether I'm thinking of a sheep here or something like this. If we put like a little head on it there and a couple of feet, we could have a very round like sheep. Okay, but yeah, sort of fur. This one is loosely inspired by tree bark, okay, which tends to go up the form, and then also has these sort of almost like lots of little cylinder forms that go up it. So it's good when you're doing this exercise is to almost have a texture in mind, and this one was meant to be, yeah, just like brick or sort of stone or something like that. But equally, you could try all different textures on all these different forms, and that's what I would like to encourage you to do. I'm just going to put a little shadow on there just so we know which way the light's coming. So hopefully you can see there that I've done it in such a way that I'm emphasizing the form, so I'm aware of the wrapping lines and the perspective, and I'm also aware of the light source. So they're things that you need to be aware of. Okay, so once you've practiced a variety, you've created a few almost pages of these different textures, and you've started to apply them to your sort of abstract forms, you can then start to tackle actual real world examples, okay? But all the same principles apply. So if I do, for example, a carrot here, so you can see how much the texture, if we create a sort of carrot going into the distance. Okay, so I'm trying to break the line up with sort of texture work. You don't want too smooth a line, okay? So this is where the construction ideas really help you. So let's say we've got, well, perhaps we won't give it as much of a stalk as that. Let's say it's been cut short. Okay, so when we shade in our carrot, okay, and we're wanting to create texture, we're also trying to be very much aware of our wrapping lines and trying to create the sense of form, okay? Anyway, I've got some exercises for you this week. So we're going to try and practice this in a few different mediums and with some different things. But the main thing is just to experiment and have fun with it. Start to look around you, look at different textures, and try to think about how you might recreate them in your drawing. Often people don't get beyond just doing simple, almost abstract line drawings of their subjects. Once you start to introduce texture though, your drawings will really come to life. So it's definitely something worth persevering with. Anyway, I hope you find some of the upcoming exercises useful, and I will see you again soon. So thanks a lot. Bye.